In the chaotic final years of the 20th century, as the Soviet Union fractured into 15 newly independent states and a vast military-industrial complex found itself suddenly orphaned, a peculiar form of commerce emerged in the shadows of legitimate international trade. While diplomats signed arms reduction treaties and economists debated shock therapy reforms, another economy was taking shape. One measured not in official statistics, but in unmarked crates, falsified customs documents, and handshake deals in hotel lobbies from Warsaw to Bogota. At the center of this shadow trade sat Russian organized networks with deep roots in the Soviet system, connections that reached from crumbling military bases to the highest offices of post-Soviet bureaucracy, and an almost entrepreneurial willingness to treat weapons of war as just another commodity awaiting the right buyer. Among the most audacious transactions of this era involved not small arms or ammunition, which moved across borders by the ton with relative ease, but something far more conspicuous: military helicopters. Specifically, 6mm Mi-8 transport helicopters, workhorses of Soviet aviation that had seen service from Afghanistan to Angola, each capable of carrying troops, cargo, or, with minor modifications, substantial quantities of high-value contraband across difficult terrain. The asking price was $1 million per aircraft, a figure that reflected not just the hardware itself, but the intricate web of bribes, forged paperwork, and logistical coordination required to move such visible, recognizable military equipment halfway around the world without triggering international alarms. The destination was Colombia, a country already synonymous in the global imagination with the production and distribution of a particular agricultural product that generated more revenue than coffee, flowers, and emeralds combined. For the organizations controlling that trade, helicopters represented a transformative capability. The geography of Colombia, dense rainforest, high mountains, remote river valleys, had always been both an asset and a challenge. Moving product from clandestine processing facilities to collection points, and from there to airstrips or coastal loading zones, required transportation that could bypass roads, checkpoints, and government patrols. Helicopters, especially rugged Soviet-designed machines built to operate in harsh conditions with minimal maintenance, were perfect tools for this logistical puzzle. But how does one move a military helicopter, painted in recognizable camouflage patterns and bearing serial numbers traceable to Soviet Air Force inventories, from a base in Russia or Ukraine to a jungle clearing in South America? The answer lay in one of the oldest tricks in the smuggling handbook: mislabeling. Each Mi-8 was carefully disassembled, its rotor blades removed, its fuselage sections separated, and the components packed into standard shipping containers. The paperwork accompanying these containers described them as humanitarian aid, medical supplies perhaps, or agricultural equipment destined for rural development projects. Customs officials in transit countries, already overwhelmed by the explosion of post-Soviet trade and often willing to look the other way for the right consideration, waved the shipments through. At each stage of the journey, from the loading docks of Baltic or Black Sea ports to transshipment hubs in Western Europe or West Africa, another layer of fabricated documentation was added. Shell companies with respectable-sounding names and addresses in anonymous office parks provided invoices and certificates of origin. Freight forwarders, some complicit and some simply incurious, arranged the actual transport. By the time the containers reached Colombian ports, they had been transformed, on paper at least, into entirely legitimate cargo. Once inland and beyond the scrutiny of port authorities, the containers were opened, the helicopters reassembled by mechanics who had learned their trade in Soviet military academies, and the aircraft quietly entered service in a very different kind of operation than their designers had ever imagined. The helicopters, however, were merely one category in a much broader catalog of hardware that found its way onto the international black market during the 1990s. As the Russian economy spiraled into dysfunction and military budgets shrank to fractions of their Cold War levels, entire bases found themselves in a state of surreal abandonment. Tanks sat in rows, their fuel tanks empty and their crews long since demobilized. Armored personnel carriers rusted in open fields. Artillery pieces, anti-aircraft systems, and even missile launchers awaited uncertain fates. For officers charged with guarding this equipment, the temptation was overwhelming. Salaries went unpaid for months. families faced real hardship. Meanwhile, middlemen appeared with cash, connections, and a willingness to handle all the messy details of export. Poland, strategically positioned at the crossroads of East and West, and still adjusting to its own post-communist transition, became an unexpected hub for this illicit trade. During the Cold War, as a key member of the Warsaw Pact, Poland had hosted Soviet military units, maintained extensive repair and logistics facilities, and developed bureaucratic expertise in moving military equipment across borders under the framework of alliance cooperation. When the alliance dissolved and Soviet forces withdrew, much of that infrastructure remained. Warehouses, transportation networks, and crucially, officials who understood the paperwork required to make a tank or an armored vehicle disappear from one inventory and reappear, legally or otherwise, in another. Fictitious companies proliferated in Warsaw and other Polish cities during this period, often nothing more than a registered address, a fax number, and a brass nameplate on a shared office door. These entities served as fronts for transactions that could not bear scrutiny. A shell company might purchase decommissioned military vehicles from a cash-strapped Ukrainian base, ostensibly for scrap metal or museum display. The same vehicles would then be resold through another layer of paperwork to a buyer in Africa, Asia, or Latin America, where questions about provenance were rarely asked and end-user certificates could be obtained with relative ease. The profits from such deals were substantial, and they were shared among a network of facilitators that included former Soviet officers, Polish businessmen with the right connections, and international arms brokers who specialized in navigating the gray zones of export law. Tanks and armored personnel carriers were not the limit of what moved through these channels. Anti-tank missiles, surface-to-air systems, and even components for more sophisticated weapons found buyers. The demand was global and varied. Governments facing insurgencies sought firepower. Rebel groups and militias required tools to challenge those same governments. Criminal organizations, particularly those operating in regions with weak state control, saw military-grade equipment as a means to protect lucrative operations or intimidate rivals. The supply, drawn from the vast and poorly guarded arsenals left behind by the Soviet collapse, seemed almost inexhaustible. At the same time, a parallel and far stranger narrative unfolded in the realm of naval vessels, blending official state-to-state commerce with the kind of opportunistic dealing that characterized the era. In one of the most surreal barter arrangements of the late Soviet period, Moscow had agreed to exchange a fleet of decommissioned submarines and surface vessels to the PepsiCo Corporation in return for a continued supply of cola syrup and the rights to distribute Pepsi products across Soviet territory. The deal, conducted in the open and celebrated in business journals as an example of creative Cold War-era trade, involved actual warships, diesel submarines, a cruiser, a frigate, and several destroyers, which Pepsi promptly sold for scrap metal, making the American beverage company, for a brief and bizarre moment, the operator of one of the world's larger naval fleets. This official transaction, however absurd it appeared to outside observers, provided a kind of cover and normalization for far less transparent deals involving naval hardware. If submarines could be legally bartered for soft drinks, then perhaps, with the right paperwork and the right contacts, they could also be sold, leased, or transferred under other arrangements that existed in the murky space between legality and outright crime. Throughout the 1990s, rumors circulated in intelligence circles and among maritime security analysts of submarines being quietly offered to private buyers. These were not the massive nuclear-powered strategic boats that dominated Cold War nightmares, but smaller diesel-electric vessels, Foxtrot-class, Kilo-class, and others, still highly capable and, more importantly, available. The mechanics of such transactions were necessarily opaque, but the broad outlines could be pieced together from intercepted communications, informant reports, and the occasional investigation that reached far enough to glimpse the network before being shut down by jurisdictional disputes or political pressure. A prospective buyer, often an intermediary representing a criminal organization or a rogue state entity, would be provided with photographs of vessels sitting at naval bases. These images, sometimes taken by base personnel themselves in exchange for payment, showed submarines in various states of maintenance, their condition documented with the clinical precision of a real estate listing. Specifications would be discussed. range, depth capability, crew requirements, torpedo capacity, and the feasibility of modifications for non-military purposes. Once interest was established, negotiations would proceed through layers of intermediaries, each insulating the others from direct exposure. Prices varied wildly depending on the vessel's condition, the urgency of the buyer, and the level of official complicity required to complete the transfer. Payment structures were complex, often involving multiple tranches deposited in different banks, with portions earmarked for various facilitators along the chain. Base commanders who would sign off on decommissioning paperwork, harbor officials who would overlook irregularities in departure logs, and customs authorities in transit countries who would ensure that questions were not asked when a submarine appeared in their territorial waters under a dubious flag of convenience. The most challenging aspect of these deals was not the acquisition itself, but the delivery and subsequent operation. Unlike a crate of rifles or even a disassembled helicopter, a submarine cannot be easily hidden or transported by conventional freight methods. It must travel under its own power or be towed, both of which require at least a skeleton crew with specialized training, fuel, and a plausible cover story for any Navy or Coast Guard that might take an interest. Routes were carefully planned to avoid the scrutiny of NATO naval patrols and to take advantage of jurisdictions with lax enforcement or officials willing to be persuaded. In some cases, vessels were transferred at sea, their Soviet ensigns lowered and replaced with the flag of some obliging registry, their names repainted overnight, their histories officially erased from Russian naval records as if they had never existed. What happened to these submarines once they reached their final destinations varied. Some were genuinely scrapped, their hulls cut apart in shipyards that specialized in dismantling Cold War surplus. Others found more creative second lives. A few were reportedly converted into underwater cargo vessels, their military systems removed and replaced with cargo holds designed to carry high-value contraband beneath the reach of surface patrols and aerial surveillance. Still others were simply kept in reserve, floating in remote harbors or moored to decaying piers. Insurance policies against future contingencies or potential resale if circumstances changed. The networks that facilitated these transactions were remarkably diverse, drawing on talent and connections from across the former Soviet space and beyond. At the top sat individuals who combined criminal audacity with insider knowledge of military logistics and political access. Many had backgrounds in Soviet state security services or military intelligence, organizations that had spent decades moving sensitive materials across borders under the guise of official programs. These skills, once employed in the service of ideology and superpower competition, were now redirected toward profit. Below them operated a layer of fixers and brokers, often ethnic Russians or Ukrainians living in Western Europe, the Middle East, or Latin America, who served as bridges between buyers and sellers. They spoke multiple languages, understood the legal systems of several countries well enough to exploit their weaknesses, and maintained relationships with corrupt officials in customs agencies, port authorities, and export licensing bureaus. Their value lay not in physical access to weapons, but in their ability to navigate bureaucratic obstacles, forge the necessary paperwork, and ensure that transactions proceeded smoothly without attracting unwanted attention. At the ground level were the facilitators who handled logistics, truck drivers who knew which border crossings to avoid, warehouse managers who could store sensitive cargo without asking questions, and mechanics who could reassemble complex military equipment in improvised workshops far from the factories where it had been built. Many of these individuals operated in a moral gray zone, aware that their work served criminal enterprises but able to rationalize their participation as simply doing business in difficult times. Others were fully complicit, motivated by greed or by their own entanglements with organized networks that offered both opportunity and, when necessary, coercion. The broader geopolitical context of the 1990s made all of this possible. Western governments, preoccupied with managing the post-Cold War transition, integrating former Warsaw Pact countries into NATO and the European Union, and addressing immediate crises in the Balkans and elsewhere, devoted limited resources to tracking the dispersal of Soviet-era weapons. Intelligence agencies were aware of the problem, and reports circulated documenting specific transactions and identifying key facilitators. But the sheer scale of the phenomenon overwhelmed enforcement capacity. Prosecutions were rare, often hampered by jurisdictional challenges, lack of cooperation between countries, and the difficulty of gathering evidence that would stand up in court. Moreover, the distinction between legal and illegal arms transfers was often blurry. Governments engaged in their own surplus sales, sometimes to questionable buyers, under the justification of foreign policy objectives or economic necessity. Private defense contractors operated in the same markets, moving equipment that, while perhaps not cutting edge, was still lethal and destabilizing. In this environment, criminal networks could exploit the ambiguity, hiding behind layers of legitimate-seeming transactions and deniability. For the receiving countries and organizations, the influx of Soviet-era military hardware had profound and often tragic consequences. Conflicts that might have remained localized skirmishes erupted into full-scale wars when one side suddenly acquired tanks or attack helicopters. Insurgencies that had relied on small arms found themselves equipped with anti-aircraft missiles capable of downing government helicopters and transport planes. Criminal organizations grew bolder, their firepower rivaling or exceeding that of the police forces arrayed against them. The human cost, measured in casualties, displacement, and prolonged instability, was immense, and it rippled across regions far removed from the decaying military bases of the former Soviet Union where the weapons had originated. By the end of the 1990s, as Russia began to stabilize under new leadership and Western attention slowly turned toward the problem of loose weapons, the most chaotic phase of post-Soviet arms trafficking began to wind down. Security at military installations improved, at least marginally. International agreements tightened export controls and increased information sharing among governments. Some of the most egregious facilitators were arrested or went into hiding, their networks disrupted if not entirely dismantled. Yet the legacy of that decade, thousands of tons of weapons scattered across the globe, submarines and helicopters repurposed for criminal enterprise, and the normalization of a trade that blurred the line between state policy and organized crime, continued to shape global security for years to come.